Welcome, Hervé. I'm here today with Hervé Seligmann, and first I want to give you an idea who he is, and then we are going to dive into the very impressive work he has done. Seligmann is a theoretical evolutionary researcher and a biologist known for his interdisciplinary work on molecular evolution, genetic information emergence, and post-pathogen co-evolution. He has a BSc and an MSc in biology and plant physiology, followed by a PhD on microevolution in lizards. And his postdoctoral work spanned molecular evolution and theoretical biology at institutions including the Louisiana State University here in the US, the University of Chicago, Victoria University in New Zealand, and also the University of Oslo. He has held research appointments at the Center for Ecological and Evolutionary Synthesis at the University of Oslo, and then later became a senior researcher at Aix-Marseille University in France within the URMIT. And the URMIT is the Research Institute for Infectious and Tropical Diseases, correct, Hervé?
Yes, it's correct, but afterwards it became the IHU of Aix-Marseille, and it's the unit of and now the institute of Dr. Didier Raoult that everybody knows about.
Okay. He has published and co-authored a lot of analysis related to both the COVID-19 infection mechanisms and also the mRNA vaccine effects. And we are going to talk about this here in a moment. Hervé, before we get into your research findings concerning the mRNA shots and SARS-CoV-2, I wanted to ask you a question. You know, you live in Luxembourg. And in March 2020, you also lived in Luxembourg. Is that correct?
Yes.
So what was that like for you as a scientist in March 2020 when you saw what was happening all around you with the lockdowns and everything else?
Well, at first I believed it, but I expected that it would not last more than 3 months. And the reason is that the cycle, let's call it the microevolutionary cycle of RNA virus, like the flu virus or this one, this corona, will not be very long, especially if it is spreading so quickly all over the world. So I didn't expect anything long term, assuming that everything was natural. Then the second point is I started finding something weird, and that was already a month before, because the geographic informatician, meaning the guy dealing with the GIS system where I was, had asked me in January, yeah, Hervé, I'm very afraid. I told him, don't be afraid. This thing is in Wuhan, in China. It's not going to go out of there. These things are not so serious. They get serious because in China, they are so corrupt. Everybody is afraid of telling his boss and so on. So in the end, but it's not going to happen that way in other places. And then I told him about what happened in Western Africa with Ebola in 2014. These things, they can, especially if they are so, Ebola is extremely dangerous and relative, but it cannot spread so much. So I told him something that spreads so much, like a normal flu or how you say this, sniffles, they can't be that bad. Then a month later, I told him, look, this is what I told you before. That was only assuming that it's natural. And I didn't say more. He was supposed to understand that there's something fishy here going on. Then after that, I started feeling unwell in late March, and I thought, oh, so it must be that new disease, but I never coughed. I never had fever. So I said, okay, I'm so-called asymptomatic, but then what is it that I have all the time, tired and so on? So I went to doctors, several doctors, did all the tests. Nothing came out positive, nothing. But these effects of tiredness and brain fog were all the time there. But I have never had coronavirus, never a positive test, not PCR and not antibodies. So that's a bit strange. And then it went away after 6 months. That's my
Oh,
2020 period. And I
after
did
6 months.
work,
Wow. Okay.
less work
Hmm.
than I would do before, but I did. But this was really strange. And today I'm going to tell you, to all the people who say I don't know what, well, this virus did not affect people in a normal way. There is no virus that does this kind of symptoms that I have been describing that might not have been because of the COVID thing. But these are what is called post-viral syndrome symptoms that happen very rarely, like the flu 1 in 10,000. So let's call it rarely, not very rarely. Very rarely is 1 in 100,000, approximately. I mean, that's the rule of thumb thing. And here it's said 1 in 10, 1 in 5, something like that, develop long COVID, which is post-COVID virus long-term effects or medium-term effects. So that's not normal. That doesn't happen in nature. There is no coronavirus that does that. And then suddenly you have one and it appears on every continent within the same months. This can't work if you don't do something for it. You can't synchronize these things, even with planes and everything. That doesn't work that way because it's not going to spread the way you designed it. Even if you did do it, you need really something very, very special to create that. This synchronous appearance everywhere. I don't believe in it. So maybe some people will say, no, it's not true. And with planes today, it happens. But then the flu virus would appear every year everywhere too, because the year before and all the years before, there were also planes and people coming from everywhere in China, everywhere. And yes, the flu virus more or less starts in southern China, northern, what was called Indochina, and so on, every year too. It's the same region, as far as I can know. Maybe I'm wrong here, but that's so something was very fishy, very strange.
Right. And then in 2021, you started your work on the vaccine safety of the mRNA vaccines. Is that correct?
So I never analyzed separately the different vaccines. So there are some who are DNA vaccines, like Janssen, the Johnson and Johnson one, Janssen called, and then AstraZeneca, maybe also some others. I don't know all of them. I look at them all together, and also because there isn't so much data distinguishing between them. So I have an overall injection rate, whatever type of vaccine it is. But yes, most of it is Pfizer. So it is RNA, mRNA. So towards in summer 20, I started already thinking something is fishy with that vaccine. And that's important. So 6 months in advance, and I never worked on these things, right? My background on immunology is the introductory course, 1 semester long at university, second year. So I have very general basic information on that. But the first thing was, okay, so many people have been exposed to the virus already at that time, and they are not telling people in advance on the radio, in the journals and so on the TV, that if you had it or even if you might have had it, you cannot take the vaccine, because that's a rule for any vaccine. Someone who had a disease doesn't need it, most probably, and might be in danger of overreacting. So
Right.
that was extremely fishy. I mean, suspicious. Something was not okay. Then, in addition, a new technique, and then developed within a few months, that was again not normal. Even if it was an old technique, you don't develop a medication without at least 10 years, past 5 years, typically 15 years. It was so there were 2 points. And then there is a third point that I checked over the years, because it's so difficult to get accurate information. You do not inject in the blood something related that will cause antibodies in the blood for a virus that comes via the respiratory circuit, via the nose and the throat. because that's not the same antibodies. You have mucosal antibodies and you have humoral antibodies. Humoral is the lymph and the blood, and mucosal are for all the mucouses, of course, saliva, nose, and then also in the belly and so on. But that's not the same. These systems are quite independent. And basically, the general, which is very simple, the body reacts where it is aggressed, not in, it doesn't react at places it's not aggressed. When you inject the vaccine, you are faking an invasion, but it's in the blood. It's not going to be in the mucus, in your nose. So it's never going to protect. And that you could know before starting.
So that's very interesting, Hervé. Does that mean, does that also hold true for the flu vaccine then?
Yeah, of course.
So the flu vaccine then is just useless?
So maybe, I don't know, because again, I never thought about the flu vaccine before at that time, certainly. But yeah, it should be true for the flu vaccine. In theory, yes, when you have something that goes into the blood, which is the very bad phase, okay, in theory, it could be helping you, but it's not going to prevent you from getting the early stages of the disease. It goes into the nose, it stays into the throat, and then you cough a week. And if you are healthy, it's over. That's true for, and then it goes into the lungs, and then you get into the bad phase, and from the lungs, it goes into the blood, and you're basically likely dead, not necessarily, but
yeah, you know
you have
what
to
you
stop it
just
before.
you know what you just said reminds me of Dr. Peter McCullough and his insistence that what does protect against SARS-CoV-2 is the nasal spray. He recommended an iodine spray, for example, that you spray into your nose to fight the virus right there in the mucus.
Well, at this point, and maybe I'm wrong here. Really, I don't mean, I'm suspicious of anything. And so maybe he's right and he's not spraying because now you don't know if the classical flu vaccines, that's how I told my parents to stop getting it. I told them, who tells you they are not giving you mRNA flu vaccines? I told them, stop it because you don't know what they are telling you. They are simply lying. If you start a bit lying, you can be lying even more.
I know you have some slides prepared for us, and you can show your screen and then start discussing your research and your findings.
So I assume that you're seeing my first slide. I'm going to show you a lot of things that I have found, which are also positive results, meaning what we believe are true things, observations on what the vaccines are doing. But together with that, you're going to see data falsifications and manipulations. And the more time goes on, and the more there are. Maybe because I became more aware, but I think there are more and worse falsifications. So the first thing that I'm going to show you is a chronology of the things that I have seen, and that in the end, without going into we are going to go into the details, but it's simply this chronology shows that the injections should have been immediately stopped because there was data, public data that I did find already January and February 2021 that clearly showed that people were dying from the vaccines and especially people who had COVID. So the first observation was in mid-February 21. At that time, there were globally 108 million people injected. And we found that it was based on data published by the Israeli Health Ministry on YNAT. That article was saying, oh, look, the COVID injections work, there are fewer deaths. But actually, there were fewer deaths, but at that time, there were much fewer people who were injected. So the people who had COVID and were injected were few. And the proportion of dead was much larger than for the uninjected people. There were like 300,000 uninjected people with COVID and only 2,000 injected with COVID. So in the end, even if there were only 100 dead in one group and let's say 400 in the other group, relatively speaking, it was actually the opposite. The death rate was actually much higher in the injected people. So a month later, some German fact checkers said, no, it's not true. And they published again updated data from the Israeli Health Ministry, again saying the same thing. But again, exactly the same error of it's not a falsification. Probably the data were true, but they were incorrectly presented because they didn't take into account sample size. You have to report your results to the size of the sample, meaning calculating percentages.
Right. Yes. But I mean, that's just basic. Everybody knows that. I mean, so to give the results, to give the data that kind of spin, that can't have been an error or mistake.
Twice, not twice, because they are reacting at that moment to what we had already published a month before, explaining the very obvious thing of you need to calculate percentages,
Right.
a rate,
Of course.
basically.
Yeah.
And so they are clearly lying. And as I remind you, the thing that I told you just before about the nose and the blood and so on, or you don't inject someone who already had the disease. Everybody knows that. Certainly everybody who did the introductory course to immunology as a doctor, as a pharmacologist, as a medic, or as a biologist. That's a lot of people. Even people who didn't do big studies know that.
Yes. I mean, people just know that. I mean, kind of like
And
everybody
no one
knew
told
that
you
before.
that before I just told you. 5 years later.
Yeah.
So in March, already 240 million people injected worldwide. And at the same time, there is a publication in New England Journal of Medicine, again, an Israeli study by Dagan et al., who looked at 1.2 million people, and their data were tabulated as an addendum, an appendix to their paper. They didn't discuss it, but these data showed that in the time between the first and the second injection, and a little bit later also, the injected people had in total 2 to 3 times more COVID infections than the uninjected people. So again, that wasn't, no one apparently cared about it, and they omitted saying it. Let's say it that way. That's a problem.
By the way, I have a question there. So in the United States, the people in between the first and second injections were considered unvaccinated. And if they died of COVID, that wasn't, they died as an unvaccinated person. Was that the same in Israel?
I assume it was the same in Israel. What I'm certain is here in Luxembourg, it was that way. And this gave them the possibility of showing how much more the non-injected died more than the injected. But actually, it is because of due to the first injection, there is an increased infection rate and therefore an increased death rate from COVID. But it is the result of the injection. Even if you're not, and you are injected, you're not considered immunologically able, let's say. But it is not. But it's like saying you start chemotherapy and for cancer, and it lasts 6 months, and we know that chemotherapy is a very dangerous thing and treatment. And you say, oh, if you survived chemotherapy, you have a good chance of surviving cancer. Yeah, but you have to take into account all the deaths before you finish the treatment. This includes the treatment time. And first to second injection, that's treatment time. So you have to include it. It's a lie to exclude it. It's simply a lie. Besides that later on we can show that these injections, they didn't work even after they are supposed to have been working.
Yes, yeah. I agree. It was a lie, and it was a really important lie to scare people into thinking that COVID is much, deadlier than it was, and that they should get the vaccine.
Well, it is deadlier if you are weakened, fragilized by the vaccines, among others. And that's really a serious thing. So the actual thing is the combination of COVID and the vaccine that increased deaths. And then there, of course, is the lying of saying the false positives after you died from a road accident and so on. All these things happened despite that we did not know too well about it at the time. There were probably, I don't remember exactly, people talking about these things already at the beginning. So in May, we do a petition to the Israeli High Court to get more precise data on what happened. And in that, we already said, look, from what we see, we predict that the injections will have even more adverse events in the young than in the old, because there were data suggesting it. And at that time, I already knew, even if I didn't publish it at that time, that from the Euromomo all-cause mortality rates, I had seen that for different age classes, the more in a country there were injections and the more people died during the 5 weeks after the first injection. And these were at the time adult injections. But by chance, I saw that the children mortality from Euromomo was also proportional to adult injection rates. So this was very hard to me to believe. And it took me about 2 months until I published it, because for psychological reasons, basically, that I couldn't believe the result, despite it being very clear. So I checked a lot. I waited to get 2 more months of data and so on, but I had seen it already in April. And the result is, yes, the children who were basically uninjected at the time were dying proportionally to adult injections. And that suggested vaccine shedding in some way that we don't know. But the more adults were injected in Europe and the more children died. At that time, there are already 1.6 billion people injected worldwide. Again, you see how quickly it went. In September, because my sister told me that my older niece was getting injected, I said, what can I do? What can I do? And I saw about fertility rates, and I took fertility rates until that date in 21 compared to fertility rates in 2020 for about 200 countries worldwide. And I checked correlations with injection rates up to September again in these countries. I didn't find it for all countries, but there were enough. And actually, I found data for injection rates for women and separately for men. And I checked for the correlations. And when you did the analysis correctly, you find that the fertility decreases proportionally to female but not male injection rates in 21. So that was, again, a very important result, which I saw, as I said, I published it in September 21. At that time, over 3 billion people were injected. So that's the thing. Now, when you have the principle of precaution is that any evidence, even if it's not considered as proof, like correlational evidence, is sufficient to stop. There is no burden of proof to stop a treatment. There is a burden of proof to start it, not the other way around. And so there is a total inversion of every principle, basically. So the next,
Well, actually, with the exception of vaccines in general, at least here for the United States, I mean, for vaccines, there hasn't really been a burden of proof, but that wasn't really clear to the population before COVID.
There are words that trigger people and put them into some thinking lane. So vaccine says, oh, good, so there can't be anything bad. But that's not true. Different types of vaccines, different types of diseases, and so on. People have to stop thinking in the words are actually traps that direct you into thinking in a very specific way. That's basically programmation in a sense, at least human mind programmation, via words and concepts that are attached to it. The fact that you say this is a vaccine doesn't mean it's actually a vaccine, or doesn't mean it's going to be good as all the previous vaccines, if you assume that we were not lied also for the previous ones. And everything, even that you use a given word, everything has to be proven separately. And you cannot do a generalize, especially not in a world where words are used to manipulate you. That's exactly what has happened.
Right.
And
Right.
so the word vaccine is a trap. I believe that the smallpox vaccine is working. I'm not sure for all the other vaccines. And the smallpox vaccine is, at least originally, is a natural thing, right? You take a pox virus that is not dangerous to people and that affects cows, that is sufficiently similar to the dangerous smallpox virus, but because there is cross immunity, if you had the cow virus, and therefore the immunity to that cow virus, you're not going to develop smallpox. And that's, I believe, maybe someone is specialized. I'm not specialized in these things, I remind you again. But I believe that vaccine works, but that's not the same as all the later vaccines who are named after it, because vax comes from cow, and it means all that injection or that treatment that is based on a vax virus, then gives its name to stuff that has nothing to do to a cow. And that's maybe etymologically okay. That's how words develop. But you cannot assume they are all the same or so similar. They are not. They simply are not. And this is really the way we are being manipulated with words, doing generalizations in relation to specific words. But that's not our subject, basically. I mean, it is, but without being it. So continuing our chronology, let's say, in winter 23, Barry Young leaked these data from health insurances from New Zealand. And these were a lot of data, and I analyzed them and then published in 24 and late 23 the results. And some maybe we will have the time to show today. So they confirmed increased mortalities for the injected at least up to 2 years post-injection, because we are not later than 2 years after injection. Right. So of course we can't say if it goes on after. That's what they show. They show something that no one else discussed, even if it is quite obvious, that people who had a relatively short delay between injection 1 and 2 or 2 and 3 and so on were more likely to die than people who had longer delays between injections. And that was an important result in a sense, because it was also interrelated with age, because maybe later I'll show it, that younger people need a shorter delay to die. So apparently young people, and remember that, they get rid of the vaccine faster. So in order to have an overdose, you need a shorter delay between 2 successive doses. That's an important thing to say. So
yeah, you have an interesting graph for that. We can look at that later on. That shows it very nicely. Mm-hmm.
So then I also worked about batch specific nocivity on these data, and actually in the 100 batches from New Zealand, I did not find clear indications of placebo batches, but I did find batch-specific nocivity. So there was no batch that was not dangerous, at least.
And nocivity means toxicity, right?
Yes, that's what I mean. And it's measured by the mortality after injection. I didn't have anything. But I can tell you there is a batch-specific mortality, because people who got that batch after the first shot, and that batch, let's say, had the highest mortality, if I look at the second shot or the third or the fourth shot, they still will be more or less the highest mortality batch. And the same for the lowest mortality batches. There is it's systematic. Whatever shot you're getting, if it's from that batch, you're going to have the highest mortality rate for that shot. And the same way about the least mortality batch. And you have some kind of systematic point here, which says, yes, there are more or less toxic batches, and I don't know why it is. And that also could mean that some batches cause some diseases more and other diseases more. Maybe some go more on the nerves and the others more on the heart or whatever. I don't know, but I don't have data on that. Another point is that because you see higher death rates, you would also actually see an accelerated aging in a sense by the injections. And the injections would accelerate for older people the aging rate by 2 to 3 times, which means that for an injected person of age 60, let's say, or 50, 1 year is as much aging as 2 to 3 years for a non-injected person.